but I would like to welcome you all. This is a great turnout for Preservation Connecticut's weekly Talking About Preservation. And we're really excited to present Archaeology in Connecticut today with our guests, Sarah Sportman, the State Archaeologist, and Cathy Labadia from the State Historic Preservation Office. This series of noontime chats has been our effort to keep engaged with all of you in the community during these strange COVID times, and we find it really, just really terrific to be able to touch base with everyone, see your faces, hear what you're working on, what your questions are, and just have an opportunity to share with you some of the work that we do in the field and who some of our partners are and all the fantastic work that our partners are doing. So if you don't know Preservation Connecticut, we were established as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly. And just this past year, we decided to modernize our name and become Preservation Connecticut. We're still the same great organization. We've been in business for over 45 years now, and you're a statewide nonprofit advocate, educator, technical assistance provider, grant facilitator, anything that you need preservation-wise, Preservation Connecticut is here to provide it. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to our guest today. That's who you've tuned in to learn from. So Cathy Labadia and Sarah Sportman, I'll let you take it away. And if you need the slides advanced, just give Stacy a cue. Cathy, you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
If I can, I'll just start with a little opening, which is to admit that I was a bad student for today. And I'm on vacation and I forgot to bring the charger for my laptop, so all I have is an iPad. And so Sarah has done an excellent job preparing the slides for today. And I'm just going to kind of roll with the flow. So I'm letting Sarah take the lead, and I'll be there to speak on behalf of SHPO when that time comes up.
Well, you get points for joining us on your vacation. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. What we kind of thought we'd talk about today is just a little bit about archaeology in general, and then kind of how our two different offices function within archaeology in the state and in terms of preservation. And then maybe just talk about a couple of projects that we've had in recent years that kind of showcase the preservation side of archaeology and the different ways that archaeology kind of fits into preservation. So just in general terms, if you could put the first slide up. Archaeology at the most basic level is the study of the human past. And we do that through the excavation and analysis of the physical remains of past people's lives. So these are the architecture they left behind, the food remains, other cultural materials such as, stone tools or dishes, anything like that. Features, which are sort of non-portable artifacts that are left behind through human activity. So if you think about things like a remnant cellar hole or a storage pit or something of that nature, as well as the cultural landscapes that people used in the past and kind of left behind. So in Connecticut, most of the archaeology happens in two ways. There's compliance archaeology, which is archaeology that is done to comply with state and federal and municipal regulations regarding preservation. And then there's research-driven archaeology that's done more often, sometimes by my office, but more often by academic and avocational archaeologists in the state. The vast majority of archaeology in Connecticut happens through compliance, probably more than 90%, I would say. And archaeology at its base is a destructive process. When you excavate a site, you're removing it from the ground forever, and it can never be put back. So the way that we kind of think about preservation in terms of archaeology is, one, if there's going to be development in a particular area, we can identify sites figure out the extent of those sites and then maybe try to work around them and preserve them in place. If that's not possible, it's often necessary to excavate the site and preserve it through excavation, analysis, and interpretation. So we're collecting all the data from that site, analyzing it, and telling the story of what happened there, although the site itself is gone. Is there anything you want to add, Cathy?
No, I think that's spot on. And, I will say that, the only sad thing to me is when I see the compliance and research aspects of it. Connecticut is losing its archaeology programs within the state. And so unfortunately, the crowd of professional archaeologists that are going to be coming up over the upcoming decades is probably going to be less and less. And it's really, young people who keep a profession going. So we'll have to start recruiting them from out of state unless we can get our in-state universities to listen to that. This is a legitimate field and people can get jobs.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We're losing them quickly, not just in Connecticut, but really I'd say across the region. So I thought maybe each of us could talk a little bit about the legal framework of our jobs and how they were established and where they come from. So if you want to go first.
Sure. So the State Historic Preservation Office in Connecticut, as you know, was actually started before the the SHPO's office was started 10 years before the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in Connecticut. So the history of the office is actually older than the act. But the act is really what creates this professional preservation movement in our country. And within that, one of the interesting things I found when I first came to the office is notes about how our office was involved in the creation of the National Register criteria and the things that people were thinking about. And, I've always loved the preamble to the act that talks about how important history is to us as a country. And it becomes a guiding principle, not only for who we are, but where we're going. And it grounds us in that. And within the act, it's because there is multiple programs that come out of it, the State Historic Preservation Office is created. So there is one in every U.S. state and territory, and they have a series of responsibilities, as you all know. But one of those, and it was kind of a criterion that was not initially part of the act, is the archaeology component to it. So, the above ground is easy to see, and, a lot of why the Preservation Act came out was because it was a response to the US DOT tearing down buildings, tearing apart neighborhoods, losing places that people in their community saw as important. And so this act comes out. But the preservation movement was really bound around the built resources and not so much about archaeology. And people felt that there was already some federal archaeological legislation, but it does come in because at the same time NEPA is being proposed, as well as changes to the Transportation Act. And nobody thought that all of these laws were going to get passed. And so they decided, well, let's put archaeology in the National Historic Preservation Act just in case these other things don't happen. And I think it's the best thing that ever happened to archaeology to be considered along with our built resources as really this, this new term that we then call our cultural resources. Because that's what archaeology is. It's human culture that maybe is less visible and less reported on. And within that Historic Preservation Act, in addition to the role of archaeology within the office, I'll assist Jenny Schofield, our National Register coordinator, with National Register nominations that include an archaeological component. I'll assist my other staff members in tax credits and grants with what the potential impacts might be on archaeology, say if a house is having foundation work done or new drainage put in or additions. But the primary responsibility that I have there that's defined under the Preservation Act is the regulatory responsibilities under Section 106. So within the office, any project that has federal funding, authorizations, or other kind of approvals should be sent to our office for review and compliance. And as you can imagine, that's probably for the archaeology that gets done in this state, that is probably where most of the sites are found. And then Connecticut also passed the minor NEPA, which is the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act. And so that also gives archaeology a role in how state projects are funded and handled. And then, as you know, the State Historic Preservation Office is not just beholden to the National Historic Preservation Act, but we've developed other programs within our fields. And one of the things that was done by my predecessor, Dave Porre, was he established the Archaeology Preserve Program, which at the time it was passed was one of the first in the country, and it is actually one of the more robust ones that exists. And the Preserve Program, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, that's kind of my special niche within the office. There was a series of other laws that came through that allow for archaeological permitting on state lands. So when I'm not doing the reviews, which take the bulk of my time, I'm doing some of the other fun stuff.
In my position, which is very few states actually have a state archaeologist that functions the way Connecticut's does. In most cases, the state archaeologist is part of the State Historic Preservation Office. Having a separate position like we do is relatively rare. There's only about 6 or 7 states that have a similar kind of setup. And my position also came out of the same time period as the National Historic Preservation Act, when people were concerned about the loss of cultural resources due to development and highways and things like that. And initially, the state archaeologist was kind of a salvage position and also more of a curatorial position that was established to manage some archaeological collections that had been donated to the University of Connecticut. And over time, it's gotten more ingrained in the statutes of the state. But it did kind of start from a desire to kind of preserve some of the heritage that people felt was being lost as these projects went forward, before there were a lot of laws in place to protect them. So we can talk a little bit more about the specifics in the next couple of slides. That's sort of the way that I arranged it. But the Office of State Archaeology is written into several sections of Connecticut state statutes and has a variety of jobs, along with kind of more of a general goal of just kind of conducting research and sharing that research with the public about the archaeology of Connecticut. So if you want to put up the next slide, I think Cathy covered some of this already, but
yeah, I think that's just a great overview of what archaeology within the SHPO is responsible for. And a lot of these, you'll hear when Sarah and I talk, we work closely together because a lot of these, it's a statewide archaeology program, and we need to be on the same page and sending the same messages and share the same information. So, for a lot of this, our offices will work jointly in order to make sure that they are carried out.
So for my office, it's established by statute as part of the State Museum of Natural History and housed at the University of Connecticut, which is great because it helps to be involved with the academic side of archaeology as well as the compliance, and to interact with students and UConn's anthropology department, where I would say probably a vast number of practicing archaeologists in the state today received at least some of their training. So my office does review and compliance sort of in the way that Cathy does, but for municipal projects that sort of fall through the cracks of those state and federal regulations. And, not all towns have cultural resources regulations built into their planning and zoning, but about 40 or 50 of the towns do out of our 169 towns. And my job is to work with them on the municipal level for projects, and also to help kind of towns that are interested in developing that kind of regulatory framework to put that into place. So the goals, the duties of the state archaeologist involve identify, protecting, and researching archaeological sites. I also have mandated duties related to human remains, particularly burials that are discovered or disturbed accidentally during development, and all Native American burials and sacred sites within the site. There's some aspect of my position that deals with forensic archaeology with state and local law enforcement. We'll get called out to projects. Recently there was one in Griswold where there was basically an attempted grave robbery in a historic cemetery where someone had excavated down into a grave and then refilled it and replaced the soil. So we went out with the state police to investigate that. We also do public education and outreach and curate the state's archaeological collections. The University of Connecticut is the statutory repository for those. And I also sit on the State Historic Preservation Council. My office has a staff of 1 and I rely heavily on volunteers. So I work with students and I also have a friends group of volunteers, excuse me, FOSA, or the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, who help me go out and conduct the projects that need to be done and fulfill the duties of the office, because it's not something that I could do on my own.
I will pick this up. So the State Archaeology Preserve Program, like I said, was started by Dave Poirier about 15 years ago. And since the first listing, we now have over 35 listings. And the goal of this program is a combination of preserving sites of archaeological merit and value, but it's also about being able to publicly interpret those sites. So the Preserve program isn't for every site. I know a lot of people will contact our office and say, you know, we have something really sensitive in our backyard and we're worried about it. And a preserve status is not always the best option for that. I like to reserve the preserves for things that can also be shared with the public, because the public is extremely interested in archaeology. But, you know, as Sarah will tell you, we're always fighting against that balance of how much do you let people know. They have the right to know. It fosters interest, but it also puts the resource at risk and harm, because not everybody is looking at that information because they want to learn and they care about it. Some people, you know, have bad intentions and want to loot the sites or, you know, dig them up for whatever reason. So the benefit of the Preserve program is a lot of them are actually located on state lands, where it might otherwise be difficult for a DEP forester to monitor what's happening at the archaeological site, but it comes with very stiff penalties if it ever is disturbed. So it has this dual benefit of being on public property where people can walk by, such as the Soapstone Quarry in Peoples State Forest, same with the Barkhamsted Lighthouse, John Brown's birthplace, and you can go there and see it and experience it, but if you did harm to it, you could look at prison time and severe penalties. There are a few of the preserves that are also on private property, and those are people who are in a unique situation also where they don't mind sharing it with the public or actually wanted to have a larger public presence for the thing that was within their property, whether it be an individual, a municipality, an organization or company. And it's just, it has been a very successful program. It helps because it ensures the future preservation of these sites, but it also helps get the word out there about some of the great archaeology that we have in the state. And, you know, if we have time later, we could talk about some of these sites or, you know, some other great sites in Connecticut.
Yeah, and I would just add that the Preserve program is a great way for our 2 offices to kind of come together and deal with that preservation aspect as well as the public education aspect of that. And these are examples of some of the booklets that have been put out over the years, little kind of, you know, the archaeological site is excavated, the research is done, it's written up, and these booklets that are geared towards the public are put out, and they're very popular, and people really love to get these and read, so we hand them out at archaeology fairs and things like that, and it really helps people, you know, forge a connection to the history and archaeology of the state. So earlier it was kind of talking about how archaeology works in terms of preservation. And 2 different ways, you know, it kind of works. One is when a site can't be saved because development requires the place where it exists. If in this case, the site that you can see up here on the screen, this is in Avon, Connecticut, and it was in the location of a bridge replacement. This bridge had to be replaced. This was the place it had to go. this site was here, so the only way to preserve it was to excavate it and get all of the information from it and analyze it. So if you're familiar, I don't know if you're familiar with this site or if you've heard about it, it was excavated a couple of years ago. This was a Department of Transportation project in Avon, and it resulted in the discovery and excavation of what is at the moment the oldest site in Connecticut. It's a 12,500-year-old Paleo-Indian site. So these would have been the first people on the landscape in Connecticut after the glaciers retreated. I know that, well, Cathy, do you want to talk a little bit about this? This is kind of different because it works through the Department of Transportation, where we also have another archaeologist.
Yeah, one of the great things about Connecticut is between my office, Sarah's office, and we also have another professional archaeologist that's paid for by the state at the Office of Environmental Planning at DOT. The state really has made a commitment to archaeology in Connecticut. This particular site was identified through a regulatory process. There had been other sites from a much later time, more recent time period located there. And so we knew it was a sensitive area. And the way that this would come to our office is, for example, since there's an archaeologist at DOT, they may have preliminary looked at it and said, you know, listen, we think that there might be something here. Our office would agree with that. We'd set up a plan for identification. A firm was hired and went out there and began excavating and actually didn't find much. But one of the things that we did know was this particular geological landform has a high association with very early sites. And that would be, it's the flooded over levee associated with a branch of the, associated with the Farmington River. And so Brian Jones, who was our previous state archaeologist, was working for the firm that was with this group and had, you know, was very familiar with Paleo-Indian sites. That's what his dissertation research had been based on. And so what he did when he was out there is he had taken samples, coring down at the bottom. You know, we would dig these excavation units just to see how far we could get and what's there, these kind of exploratory units. But they can only go so deep safely. And so what he did is he took a small auger or a core and put that at the base of these units and identified these deeply stratified deposits. And so we had the suspicion that there might be something more there. And it became one of these things, you know, in what we do, we always want to avoid the impact, but the landform extended in both directions. So the idea that if they just moved the bridge, they could avoid something actually seemed to be more of a bigger problem if they moved it than we went to this location where we knew there wasn't anything more recent. So there was a very carefully constructed and phased out approach that would be done to allow for more archaeology in conjunction with construction. So it was a very complicated project. Sarah at that time was working with the firm who was out there. And I think everybody, even though we had this suspicion, we were surprised when the artifacts started coming out, and then when the date came back, it was absolutely remarkable. And, you know, I'll let Sarah talk about maybe some of the more research aspects of it, but it even just regionally, it's an amazing.
Yeah, so for the perspective of this site, another aspect of why it was so complicated is that it is right on the Farmington River in an area where flooding over time has deposited many, many thick layers of soil. And, you know, initially when Brian went out there back in 2014, before he was even state archaeologist and he was working for a contract firm, the test pits they dug, he couldn't get to the bottom. He just wasn't confident that he could, you know that they had gotten through to a level where there might be deposits. So in order to actually test this site, we actually had to strip off 5 feet of soil with a machine and then go in and dig the test pits. And what we had was an incredibly intact site from 12,500 years ago that actually had cultural features. You can see sort of the big picture with all the little rocks on the ground. That's kind of the bottom of an excavation. The dark stains are posts from structures, probably tents from 12,500 years ago. And here's a close-up of one of the features, the middle photograph there. The artifacts we found were incredible. There's a fragment of a drilled pendant that would have been worn by somebody, and then a number of, a range of stone tools made from all different kinds of materials, including local and exotic stone. But the really interesting part about this, that this landform, it stretches all the way along the Farmington River, and normally you'd expect along a river a site would just get washed away because you do have those flood events. But it was the unique kind of geology of this area that allowed for this site to be preserved. And the effort that went into finding it and then excavating it, I think truly speaks to the dedication we have towards preserving archaeological heritage in the state. So this is another project in Wethersfield that Cathy and I were both involved with in different phases. This is also before I was state archaeologist. Do you want to talk about the regulatory side of that, and maybe I can talk about the archaeology a little
Sure.
bit?
So this is at the Webdean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, and this is part of where they were building their new addition. And so this our SHPO was involved in this from a couple different perspectives. One, they were receiving money from the state, so the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act kicked in, and we had also had an easement on the property for a prior grant that they had received. So we were actually heavily involved in this addition from its very start. And sometimes it's difficult when you're working with a group who really has put a lot of time and effort into coming up with something to suit their needs. And then our office has to say, okay, well, I know you've put 10 years into this, but can we rethink the whole thing now? And that happened at Webdean Stevens because when they were doing some of the archaeology, the area that you can see in that first aerial, there was going to be a bus pull-off and drop-off area. And so it was within the area of impact, which is, why we were doing some archaeological work there. And then this site was found. And it is another one of these unique occasions where Connecticut is not going to have another site like this. And so the effort to preserve as much of it as we could, take out information that we need now to evaluate it, and then preserve what we can became the goal here. And so I'll let Sarah talk about what the site is and what her experience was.
So this, the Webdean Stevens property has, archaeological deposits that range through all of Connecticut's history, from the earliest period of settlement in the 1630s all the way up to the 20th century. And the excavations that we did for the new education center that they're currently working on right now, that's currently under construction, revealed archaeology from all of those periods. But the most significant, and this was a surprise to everyone because the Webdean Stevens Museum, if you're familiar with it, their period of significance has always been the Revolutionary War period. It's all about Washington and Rochambeau and things like that. So we went out there and did the archaeology, and we had one test pit where we found some really, really, really early artifacts, or what seemed to be. So we went out and did a phase 2 survey and dug a couple of excavation units, and we came down on this layer. The soils are beautifully stratified, so meaning that, there was no disturbance in this area. And it looks like when they built the house that you can see in the photograph, which is from the 1760s, all the soil they excavated out of the cellar, they kind of spread around the ground surface around the house to build it up and kind of smooth out the landscape, and then actually protected earlier deposits below. So below the soils from the cellar, we found evidence of an earlier 18th century component, and also what you see here on the screen, which is a 17th century component that dates back to kind of basically the founding of Connecticut and the founding of Wethersfield. The artifact that we found in this area date to the 1630s and 40s. They would have been associated with a man named Clement Chaplin, who was one of the first settlers of Wethersfield. And if you can see in the excavation area, the dark linear stains, those are actually walls. Excavation in this area was limited, and I think that the firm that did it plans to try to go back with some grant money in the future and do a little bit more. But the question of whether these walls actually represent some kind of palisade or a protective kind of fence, or if they're walls related to a structure is unclear at this point. But we found an array of artifacts the preservation was incredible. You can see the coins on the screen. These are English farthing coins. They're as small as a dime and paper thin, and they're in excellent condition. We found clothing hooks and buttons, food remains, clay pipes, ceramics, all kinds of things that date to this very early period of Connecticut's settlement, and have the potential to shed incredible light on what life was like for those earliest settlers. So it really is a truly astonishing site. So in order to protect it, they redesigned the plan so that bus pull-off would not be in this area, and this area could just be, preserved for future research.
And I think it's great that the museum really embraced what was found, and now the story of Webdean Stevens goes far beyond the colonial period.
Thank you, Cathy and Sarah. That's a wonderful presentation. The work that you both do is just so important to Connecticut and to preservation. We really admire what you do, and thank you for sharing that with us. And with that, I'd like to open it up to some questions. I know people have questions. You can either unmute yourself or raise your hand.
I'll ask oh, I see someone else has a question. I have a question.
Go ahead, Rose.
Okay, hi, everybody. How does, as far as if a building has a historic designation, how does archaeology enter into the argument not to move the building or, any of that?
So if it has a historic designation, moving the building might actually impact just the built resource purpose of it. But what it will really depend upon is how tied the archaeology is to that nomination. So, if the building is listed primarily because it's maybe associated with the work of a master, and the archaeology does not play into the nomination at all, then it really would not be impacted by a move. So it really just depends upon what that nomination looks like, or why it was designated, what's considered important about it, and if archaeology is even a component of that.
It answers the question, but then it makes me wonder if you should do a pre-archaeological look before you do a nomination for a building?
So since I've been at SHPO and working closely with Jenny Schofield, there have been 2 building moves proposed. Both of them have had archaeological requests attached to them. And she, and it's not just Jenny, it's just more of a change in how comprehensively we look at listings, either on the state or national register. And so I think maybe 20 years ago, it wasn't given nearly as much consideration, the archaeology, in terms of the full site potential for significance. But I will say everything that's coming through our doors in the past few years, that is always at least a question that is asked at the very minimum.
Okay. That answers it for now. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a cemetery here in Plymouth that attaches to the First Congregational Church of Plymouth. It's called the Old Burying Ground. According to some old records that I have, that I actually got through the state library, there are some Native American and former slave burials there. Is that, I don't know the exact location of the burial, I just know they were included in this site. Does that offer an additional protection for this cemetery?
Cemeteries are always a little bit difficult to deal with in terms of why they're considered significant or important. And it just depends upon not specifically knowing where those individuals are. It's not that it makes that impossible. I mean, you know, certainly there's other ways to do historic research. And, you know, I'm sure Sarah can speak to the numerous times that the Office of State Archaeology has gone out to do ground penetrating radar surveys to at least identify where additional grave shafts would be. The situation you were talking about, though, is not unique in Connecticut. Pretty much every historic cemetery has a lot more people than it has gravestones. So, and a lot of times there's no gravestones and plenty of people still there, as Sarah knows. And so I think it is always something to take into consideration, but I'm not sure it provides any additional protections.
Okay, we have a contingent of, shall we say, over-enthusiastic people that are not familiar with the history, and I am concerned about their activities. You know, I've done my best to protect it, but
yeah, so now what you're saying is what you're really worried about is that they may impact an area that has these graves, but you're not sure if they're located there.
yes.
Yeah, I think that's something you'd want to talk with Sarah about. And so there is a statute in Connecticut that there are penalties associated with impacting burials. And the key to that is that you have to suspect that what your activity is may cause that impact. And so you're right. I think if you have the additional research, perhaps do a ground penetrating radar survey just to say there is this potential that graves could be here, then activities in that area, you would have an additional protection through that statute.
Oh, good.
That's something that my office can certainly help with. I have an agreement with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I do some project reviews for them, and in return, we get to use their GPR machine and technician who goes out and works on projects. And we do a lot of cemetery projects, more than anything else, just to determine if graves are actually located in areas where there aren't stones. Recently, we did one in Middletown where they wanted to plant some trees to shade the sidewalk, and there were stretches of the cemetery that went along the sidewalk that had no gravestones. But, you know, when we got in there and did the GPR, there were certainly graves. So it's just that kind of thing, and we can do it. It's non-invasive. You know, you don't have to dig or anything. It's just, are there anomalies in the soil that look like they could be human graves? And that is really, we've done enough cemeteries to have a good handle on what the footprint of those look like with ground penetrating radar, so we can give you a yes or no answer as to whether or not there are graves in that area. Not whose they are, but that they are there or are not there.
Okay, we did a small one a few years ago, but it was only a small portion of the cemetery, and I would love to do more of it so that I can provide a protection against crazy people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's something that we could help with. If you have an area of concern, you know, we can do a survey.
Okay, this cemetery dates back to 1740. So it's one of the first in this particular area. And there were a lot of people decimated in the epidemic of that time period. Many were not marked, and culturally, within the early Congregational Church, I understood that it was ostentatious to mark a grave, which leaves us as later generations kind of wondering, is it or isn't it?
Yeah, and it's common to have sections of cemeteries with no gravestones, but very rarely are there actually no burials there, particularly in historic cemeteries, because, you know, people basically buried there until they ran out of space. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm encouraged now. Thank you.
What are some of the funding sources that are available for archaeological studies?
So that always gets into a difficult situation. If there is a regulatory component to it, our office doesn't fund it because that becomes part of a project expense. But there is surveying and planning grant monies available for very specific things related to archaeology, not necessarily research, but helping to put together a preservation plan, for example, and you want to know where these resources are, the extent of them, what they are, or to help with interpretations when you're doing your National Register nominations. So the money is available, but it's the reasons why have to have a preservation focus to them. Not necessarily, you know, when Sarah was talking about full mitigation, removing all the information of the site as a form of preservation, that is in more of a regulatory function. But for the survey and planning grants, we're really looking at the archaeology geared towards preserving the site in place.
Right. Was sort of with the idea that you have to know what's there to preserve it.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Mary Beth, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we had the Boy Scout Eagle Scout project out in the back part of our property, which is the Johnson Mansion and Silver Museum in Wallingford. And while they were working on restoring this outhouse out back, they did digging around it, and they did come up with some interesting things in there. One of them being a jar with a date from 1861 and other miscellaneous things there that indicated there may have been a structure at the back of the property at one time, and there may be other things there. So we had a gentleman from Seeking the Past Historical Consulting. He is an archaeologist. He lives over in Durham. And he came out and he walked the property and looked at the information, and he gave us a proposal. And what he was talking about initially was to supervise, coordinate, and perform an archaeological survey of the location. And he goes on talking about this, saying that he would coordinate local volunteers to do the digging. And his initial proposal would be for 20 hours of survey supervision and work, and then 10 hours toward the artifact analysis, for a total of $3,000. And he said there were other spots on the back of the property that he thought would also be interesting spots to look at. Now, we do not have a lot of money just to put it out there to say, let's find out what might be here. Is there any way that someone, perhaps Sarah or someone, would be able to just give their opinion of the site and tell us if they think it's worth investing into doing some kind of an archaeological analysis there?
So I'll just say quickly, your example is an example of what you could probably use a survey and planning grant for. You're really trying to understand historic property and what may be there other than what you actually see. So you could have potentially apply for a survey and planning grant.
Okay, survey and planning.
Mm-hmm.
And the property is, by the way, on the National Register of Historic Places, so it is public in that sense, you know, that people could come back there. So that survey and planning grant, what would actually take, would that just fund what this architect is talking about, or would it be something done from your level to get involved?
We could take this offline, but if other people would benefit from this, normally what I like to do is put together what I call an archaeology plan for the property, which first means figuring out, are there significant deposits there? Are they related to the structure or what your National Register nomination is about, this period of significance? And then put together a plan for you so you understand where the sensitive areas of your property are, so that in the future, if you're doing things like planting trees or putting in a garden, you know where these deposits are and you have a plan of the property of understanding where significant things are. And then, for what is taken out of the ground, since you are a property that is shared with the public, doing some interpretation of what's found there. You know, archaeology is only as good as the story it's able to tell you about the people that lived there. And, you know, for me, the reason why I was drawn to archaeology is much of human history doesn't have a written record associated with it. You know, I can't research in a library what happened here 5 or 10,000 years ago, but I can look at the pieces that people left behind. And, you know, as I always tell people in the office, archaeology is garbage, but garbage truth. It's, you know, it's how people are actually living their lives. So it's amazing how much it may be able to tell you about the property, even if you think you already know the whole story. And so I would rather work with an organization about putting together like not just the archaeology standing alone, but taking it and doing it as a comprehensive step. That's what I'd like to see, you know, a survey and planning grant used for a particular property. I will let Sarah speak also, because I know that sometimes she works with organizations, if they, you know, that are particularly interested in doing something with volunteers or students or a different type of archaeology.
Yeah, and you know, just to build on what Cathy was saying, you know, if you just do archaeology in a vacuum, you just end up with stuff. And stuff can tell us some things about the past, but it's really how those materials fit into the story of your property. So as she was saying, it really does need to happen in conjunction with historical research on the property, you know, trying to figure out how things were laid out at the time, what might have been in that location. Can you associate these materials from a particular time period with particular individuals or events, that sort of thing. And, you know, my office does archaeological projects primarily with volunteers. I have a friends group, as I mentioned before. A lot of them have a lot of experience. We work with school groups and other kinds of organizations to give volunteer experiences in archaeology, and also to help people get archaeology completed that they need done when there's no kind of regulatory hook for it, or, you know, funding is limited. So depending on the kind of program in archaeology you're interested in doing, it may be something that my office could work with you on as well.
Are we better off having, you know, requesting the grant and having someone look over the property before hiring an archaeologist to actually come out and do this work? Which, I'm not sure which order. Do we have him come and do it to give you an idea what's there? Or should we have either one of the two of your areas come down and take a look at it before we put any money into it?
I think let's maybe we'll talk about this another time when we could talk about really what the goals are to have this work done. But don't hire anybody to do anything unless you know where it's going. So the survey and planning grant would help you to hire somebody to do this kind of work.
Oh, okay.
All right.
That sounds great. Thank you for your help.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, our email addresses are, I'm sure Jane can share them with you, and you can contact both me and Sarah, and we can figure out a good plan.
Okay,
for you.
great. Thanks a lot.
Definitely.
And of course, you know, our Preservation Connecticut circuit riders are always a good first step to call them in. They can visit the site and give you, you know, action steps of who to contact next and how to put together an action plan for applying for the grant and everything that you need to get lined up for that, and the right contacts at the SHPO office and everything. And our circuit riders are all on the call: Brad Scheid, Stacy Vero, and Mike Ferrino.
Okay, they've been out there for other things, but only looking at the house itself, not the back part of the property.
Yep, so they already have, you know, an idea of what you have at the site. So that's a good place to continue the conversation about doing an overall preservation plan that includes archaeology.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Yep.
Hi, I have a question. My name's Christina. I'm a zoning commissioner for my town in Southington, and Sarah had mentioned that you have seen some regulations, or I was just kind of looking to see, like, are these adopted regulations to zoning texts? Are they amendments? And are these more like coastal? I mean, I'm just so surprised because we have nothing. I'm working also on some historic preservation regulations and amendments for our town as well. I'm a 6'1" pony out here, 6'1" Volpe all the time, but that's okay because we're still doing things. So one of the things I'd really like to try to do is some archaeology preservation, just because last year there was a site in town that a developer had purchased, and the town got a frenzy about how wonderful this underground railroad site was that probably was just a root cellar, but the whole thing went wild and popped off to the day where people are still talking about this underground railroad site in our town. So that's troubling. Basically, I'm just wondering if there could be some examples of other zoning regulations you could recommend, or if you want to come and have an intervention here in Southington, something like that. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the duties of my office is to aid municipalities in developing and implementing that kind of regulation. So if you want to contact me off this, we can discuss that. We have some examples. I can talk to you about some of the other towns that have regulations in place, so you can look at, you know, what they have and how they have it laid out. And it's really not just coastal towns. There are towns all over the state that have it. Usually it's when there's somebody in the town who pushes for it, or somebody within the town government who has an interest in preservation. That's usually how this happens. You know, some towns are more resistant to it than others because they worry about its impact on development. But generally, you know, as far as we're concerned, the goal is to do what's right by the resources and the development, because we all know that it needs to happen. So I can definitely work with you on that.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Just to know that there's other examples, and maybe like some more recent ones too, just because I am getting some pushback on an amendment I already proposed to our regulations. And it does seem that we favor development instead of trying to put some of these things in place. So having some of that knowledge is important when I'm going up against the big dog. Thank you.
Welcome.
Susan, I know you had a question before the program began. Did you feel that that was answered during the discussion?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for our guests?
Is there some type of regulation relating to qualifications to, shall we say, refurbish and clean old gravestones?
So there is not official regulations for it, but what you would want is technical guidance. So Ruthie Apley Brown is retired now, and I still bother her, and I feel guilty about it. But helping out now would be another person who is on the call from my office, Marina Wisniewski, who has experience with conserving monuments. And I think at the very least, for some technical guidance, she can give you some assistance. And again, the circuit riders can always go out and visit a place, and you know, monument conservation does not need to be a difficult task.
Okay. We have some volunteers that are less than qualified. One was recarving with an old nail.
So Judy, I'm just going to jump in, and any sort of intervention that actually, you know, ends up being abrasive or something like that of any kind is really not advised. So I think maybe a good thing to distribute to your volunteers is the National Park Service Technical Preservation Brief about preserving monuments and gravestones. It's an online PDF and it's free. And I think you can find my email on our website. You can email me and I can send you the hyperlink right away, and you can share it with all your volunteers. And just general guidance is you want to do things that are reversible and non-damaging. So even when you're doing the reading stone, when you're trying to read stones for inscriptions, it used to be really great to put shaving cream on the stone. That's not a good idea. It has chemicals. So now we use something called raking light, which you can use a mirror or any sort of reflective surface to read it. And that's really, we try and be hands off with historic markers just because we don't know where, oftentimes we don't know, you know, really what the condition is of the stone really on the interior, what it has been subjected to in the past, and what the effects could be on any sort of abrasive cleaning materials, what have you. So if you can reach out to me through my email, it's also just my name. So you can see my name. It's marina.wisniewski@cu.gov. I'll send you that PDF.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We're almost to the end of our hour.
I guess
Someone
I'll go. My coworker was going to ask it, but he's a chicken. In this age of BLM, just kind of trying to work proactively to be a more inclusive profession, we have so many awesome people on this call. What are some of, be it not so much advice, but handlings, even myself in some of the projects that we've been on, I've had to kind of be that deterrent and say, well, this is an indigenous story and we're not working with tribal people, or this is an African and Black American story, we're not talking with this community. Now that we're in this culture that recommends that outreach, from your professional experience, like what's the best way to go about it? Because it instantly becomes a little uncomfortable, and we're trying to combat that in the field and beyond, because you're right, there's not as many programs since we lost Dr. Perry, or lost him, but since Dr. Perry retired at CCSU, he heard me say that, he's upset now. Our program at CCSU isn't the same. So wanting to encourage and be that next step, advice, thank you, love it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish we had a lot more time to talk about it. So Black Lives Matter. But I think archaeology has been grappling with this issue for more than 20 years now. It has always had a very difficult relationship with indigenous communities, and it is precisely for the things that you're talking about, is what is the story that we're telling, and whose story is it, and how are we involving people in telling their own stories? And so for the past 10 years, there's been a strong movement in archaeology for what's called community archaeology or community-based archaeology, where you're working with either the communities that are living in a place now or descendant communities and involving them in interpreting what is found in the ground. And archaeologists, I think you'll find some old school archaeologists and new school archaeologists in terms of how they think about that. I have a very, I do my profession as a science. I meet a qualification in which I can provide technical guidance. I can ensure that we are treating the resource correctly, but interpretation is not, that's not for me to do. That's for other people to do. And it gets, I think where you run into the difficulty within archaeology is the professional archaeology that's developed through cultural resource management industry, who are getting paid to do a technical approach to something, and then it ends. And we look to the universities to do the research and more storytelling approach to archaeology. And like I said, we're losing that side of it. And, I think there's ways that CRM can step up and do better, but this has been an issue ever since I've been involved. So I don't have the answers, but I certainly recognize the problem, and I do see that we are moving in a better direction. And when I first started out in archaeology, all of my professors are what I would call gentlemen archaeologists, men who came from extremely wealthy families and did archaeology as a hobby. So the times are changing, and I am really impressed by, if you've never seen the work by Whitney Baptiste Bechtel, who is at in Massachusetts at the E.B. White Center. I mean, just doing great work. And I think her as a kind of mentor to other young African-American archaeologists is what is really changing the face of how we do archaeology and the people who are getting involved in it.
Awesome.
Did you even have a question, or did I just stand on a soapbox? I'm
I
sorry.
don't think I had a question. I think it was like a let's just talk about it. But I loved that. That was great. And Tevin loved it too because he's here.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks, Christina, for raising the topic, and Cathy, that was a really thoughtful answer. And I know preservation in general, we're all struggling with that, and how to gauge all of the audiences that we're seeking to serve, and getting them to tell the story, and getting them to help determine what are the assets in their community that are important to them, and how we can assist them in serving.
Can I just say one more thing? And this is where my job becomes incredibly frustrating, because even when we have the opportunities to do that stuff, and even though there are stories out there that I think are so compelling and wonderful, the group that owns that story may not want to share it. And, and so sometimes knowing when you need to just back off is also important.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I think that ends our discussion today. This was really a great discussion, and thank you so much, Cathy and Sarah, for joining us. Really appreciate your time. And Cathy, enjoy your vacation. That's so important to have vacation time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. We'll share the slides with everyone, because there are resources at the back of the slide deck for you to reference. And of course, we'd like you all to be members of Preservation Connecticut. We are a statewide member organization, and we count on private